Viewers, in my today's class I will be discussing about demand function. In demand function, yesterday I have discussed the income demand curve. In my today's class I will be discussing about cross demand curve. So we know the demand function is Qi is a function of Pi, Y, Pj and T. This is the demand function where quantity demanded of commodity I is a function of price of commodity I, income of the consumer and price of related goods and taste and preferences of the consumer. Then what will happen if the price of related goods increases or decreases? What will happen to the demand for this good? So today we are going to learn a cross demand curve which comes under a cross demand curve. Before going to cross demand curve, let us understand what are the related goods. So Pj is a related good, the price of a related good. The goods are related by two ways. The goods may be substitutes or complementary goods. See, the price of a related good to good I, a commodity I, is a function of price of a related good. Related good J. The J may be a substitute good or a complementary good. What do we mean by a substitute good? Substitute good is, the substitute goods are those goods which satisfy the consumer the same want. So, a consumer can substitute or replace one commodity for the other commodity in order to satisfy the same want. Whereas complementary goods are those goods, both the goods are required in order to satisfy a particular want. For example, of substitutes, let us say tea and coffee. A consumer who can consume both tea and coffee, or either tea or coffee, thus his want of taking a drink, maybe he can satisfy by consuming tea or maybe he can satisfy by consuming coffee. So a cup of tea can be replaced by a cup of coffee. In this sense, both are substitutes. Then the labor and machines. Labor and machine. To some extent, labor can be replaced by machines. Not to the greater extent, but to some extent labor can be replaced by machines and machines can be replaced by labor. So labor and machine to some extent can be substituted to each other. And complementary goods are those goods where both are required for satisfying the want of the consumer or to produce a particular good. Both the inputs are required. Here in this case inputs. But for consumer, in order to satisfy his want, both the commodities he has to buy. For example, car and petrol or car or diesel. Because he wants to drive a car, buy a car, but without petrol or diesel he cannot run the car. So he has to buy both car and petrol in order to satisfy his want of driving the car or going by the car. So complementary goods are car and petrol, pen and ink. Pen and ink. Likewise, there are so many examples of complementary goods and substitute goods. What are the substitute goods? Substitute goods are those goods, any one of them are enough to satisfy a particular same want. The substitute goods are those goods which satisfy the same want of the consumer. So it can be possible to replace one commodity for the other commodity to the consumer in order to satisfy his want. Whereas complementary goods are those goods which are actually compel each other, because consumer has to buy both of them in order to satisfy his need or a want. And these are substitute goods are also called competing goods. Competing goods, because one commodity is tea and coffee. For consumers want either tea or coffee, not tea and coffee, either tea or coffee. And complementary goods are complement, compel. compel each other. Complementary goods, they compel each other because demand for one will result in demand for other one. If I demand car and I have to demand petrol also. If I don't buy car, I don't buy petrol. So they compel each other, whereas complement substitute goods are those goods they compete with each other. Either are here. So when I am taking a demand function like this, QI is a function of price of commodity I, income of the consumer, and price of related goods may be complementary or substitutes, and taste and preference of the consumer. I'll take a simple example here. See, demand for apples. Here I am taking in place of I, apples is a function of price of apples plus income of the consumer plus which are the related fruits to apples, maybe mango, price of banana, price of grapes, price of oranges, and so on, and taste and preferences of the consumer. See, these are all substitute goods. If I am taking an example of apples, demand for apples is not only a function of price of its own price, but also income of the consumer and prices of other fruits. If I can't afford the apples, because if the apple price is very, very high, so I may go for other fruits like grapes and oranges or bananas in order to satisfy my want of eating fruits. So if I cannot afford, so in this sense, when the price of apples or when the price of a related fruit increases, what will happen to demand for apples? So this is about the substitutes. Then complementary goods. Suppose demand for cars is a car. Demand for, I will not take car, pens. I can take demand for in the market as a whole I am taking is a function of price of car, of course, price of car, income of the consumer, and then petrol, price of petrol or diesel, price of petrol or diesel. Because if the price of petrol or diesel increases, what will happen to demand for cars? So may increase, if price of petrol increases, demand for cars goes down. So because the consumer has to consume the petrol as well as cars both at the same time, so the behavior of the demand curve will be different in case of complementary goods and when we compare with a substitute good. Then what is the shape of a demand curve with respect to substitute good and then with respect to complementary good? That when we are talking about a relationship between demand for commodity I with respect to the related price, then this is called cross demand, not its own demand. Its own demand means the commodity I demand with respect to its own price is its own demand. But when we are talking about other related commodities, then it is called cross demand. Cross demand for substitute goods and cross demand for complementary goods. Let us understand how the relationships look like. I'll take a simple example. Again, ceteris paribus. When I am assuming the demand for apples is a function of the price of other fruits like such as grapes, then the price of apple remain constant, income of the consumer remain constant, and taste and preferences remain constant, which is called ceteris paribus. I am only interested on finding out the relationship between the price of grapes on the quantity demanded of apples. Whereas other factors remain same, there is no change in other factors like the price of apples, income of the consumer, and taste and preferences of the consumer. Let me take an example of demand for apples. I am taking a table. Here is the quantity demanded of apples. I am writing here QD of apples, and then price of grapes. Price of grapes. For example, and apple price remains same, there is no change in the price of apples. If the price of grapes, 1 kg grapes, let us say 50 rupees, and then 5 apples the consumer used to buy. This is an hypothetical table. Because grapes and apples are substitutes, consumer, in order to satisfy his need or want of eating fruits, either he can go for apples or he can go for grapes. Then what will happen if the price of grapes increases or if the price of grapes falls? See, if the price of grapes falls to 40 from 50 rupees, then the consumer demands less of apples. Now when the price of a substitute good decreases, the demand for apples goes down. So if the price of grapes further reduces to 30, then apple demand for apple, because the price of apple remains same, there is no change. Whatever be the price of apple, let us say 5 rupees per apple, and income of the consumer, the same whatever income he has in his pocket. Since they both are same, when the price of grapes is decreasing, then the demand for apples goes on decreasing, because the consumer who was demanding apples, in its place is substituting grapes, because grapes become relatively cheaper now. If any further decrease in grapes, in summer what do we observe? Many people buy grapes only, not apples, because grapes are available at cheaper rates during summer season. As price of grapes goes down, the demand for apples goes down, which means what? A substitute good, the price decreases, the demand for the good decreases. If the price of substitute good increases, then the demand for the good increases. Then let us explain this with the help of a diagram. This table or schedule explains the relationship between the quantity demanded of apples and price of grapes. Here I am taking quantity demanded of apples. Here price of grapes. So I am taking quantity demanded 2, 3, 4, 5, here 10, 30, 40, 50. When 50 is the grapes price, then the quantity demanded of apples, the units were 5. When the price of grapes reduced from 50 to 40, then this goes down to 4. Then when it becomes 30, then 3, then 2. If you join all these points, you will get a line. This is called cross demand curve between substitutes. Cross demand curve between substitutes. This cross demand curve shows it is an upward sloping curve. For substitute goods, the cross demand curve is upward sloping. As the price of grapes, price of a substitute increases, or in this particular example decreases, the demand for apples decreases, because both are moving in the same direction. So for substitute good, the cross demand curve is upward sloping from left to right. In case of complementary goods, let me take an example of complementary goods here. Car and petrol, for example. Quantity demanded of cars and petrol price per liter. Petrol price per liter. If petrol price is, let us say, 60 rupees per liter, then the cars, some 10,000 cars, these are all hypothetical, which are not real. So 60 rupees petrol price, in the market 10,000 cars are demanded. When the petrol price increases from 60 to 80, the demand for cars goes down to 8,000. Then when the price of petrol, now the situation is more than 100 rupees per liter, then the demand for cars goes down further. If it becomes 150, maybe 2000 cars. So what kind of relationship we could see? These are complementary goods. Cars and petrol both are complementary goods because a consumer requires both of them jointly in order to satisfy his want. But in this particular case, as the price of a complementary good increases, demand for the good decreases. See, when the price of petrol is increasing, the demand for cars is decreasing. Let us plot this with the help of this table, a diagram. I am taking quantity demanded of cars on the x-axis and petrol price on the y-axis. So this is 2000, 6, 8, 10,000. Then 60, 150, 60, 80, 100, 150. Here one point here, another point here, another point here, point. If you join these points, you will get a line. This is cross demand curve. Cross demand curve for complementary goods. Cross demand curve for complementary goods. So, for substitute goods, the cross demand curve is upward sloping. For complementary goods, the cross demand curve is downward sloping, which means the relationship between the quantity demanded of commodity I and price of commodity J depends on the nature of the commodity. Nature of the commodity means whether it is a substitute or a complementary good. If it is a substitute, if you estimate the relationship, you will get a positive relationship. That is why the slope of this line is positive, because there is a direct relationship between the two. As the price of grapes increasing, the quantity demanded of apples is also increasing. But in case if it is a complementary good, a PJ, price of J, if it is a complementary good, then if the price increases, then demand for I decreases, which means there is an inverse relationship or a negative relationship, and a cross demand curve is downward sloping curve for complementary goods. So this is about the cross demand curve. In my next class, next video, I will be discussing about shift in demand curve.